Hello, welcome to Chess Master Journey. Hope all of you are doing great out there and being safe in this pandemic time. Now we'll go for queen side opening, and for today we'll be looking at the queen's gambit variation. So first of all, let's take a look at the position of queen's gambit. For queen's gambit, the first move would be white pawn to d4 square, then the black to d5 square, and then for the white, the c pawn to c4 square. So this is the position for the queen's gambit. And now let's take a look at what are the variations we have under this queen's gambit position. So first, for the black, maybe we can go for c6. So if we move the c pawn to c6 square, this will become the slave defense of the queen's gambit. So in this position, we have a lot of moves that can we do. But first, let's go one by one. So for in case we move the knight to f3 square. So this is known as the slave defense of the modern line, and to continue, black can move the knight to f6 square, and for the white we can go to the knight to c3 square. So now this is known as the slave defense of the three knight variation. And to continue, what we can do is for the black, you can push the e pawn to e6 square. So this position, as you can see, it is known as the semi-slave defense of the queen's gambit. Okay, to continue the game from here, what we can do is perhaps we can move the bishop to g5 square, so bishop to g5 square, and then we can move the black pawn to h6 so that it will be an attack for the bishop. So in this position, the bishop either can go for the knight or it can go behind here. So let's say we go for h4, so bishop to h4 square. And now this is known as the semi-slave anti-Moscow gambit. As you can see in the screen, the name is there. So after this, what we can do is the black can go for the white pawn. So dx c4. And for the white, you can develop the e pawn to e4 square. So this is one of the variation we can see if we would have moved the c6 pawn. So let's say we didn't move the c6 pawn, we choose to move some other pawn. Okay, let's say we moved the e6 pawn in this case. Okay, if we move this e6 pawn, now this position is known as the queen's gambit decline variation. Okay, to continue the game from here, so just like just now, either you can move the knight here, you can go for this knight here, or you can go for capturing the pawn. So let's say first we'll see what are the variation we will get if we move the knight to c3 square. So knight to c3 square. So this is known as the queen's gambit declined queen's knight variation. Okay, this is the queen's knight variation. So for the black, you can continue the game by moving the opposite knight to f6 square. So knight to f6 square. And now in this position, this became as the queen's gambit decline normal defense. So this is known as the normal defense position. So now what we can do is the white pawn can go after the black pawn. So cx d5. Okay, this one is known as the exchange variation. So once you capture the pawn, now the black pawn will go after the white pawn. So ex d5. So this is known as the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation. Okay, to continue the game, then we can use the bishop to move to g5 square. Then we can continue by moving the black bishop to e7 square. So for the white, we can go for the e pawn to e3 square, and then we can go for the black c pawn to c6 square. So this is still under the exchange variation, and this becomes the positional variation also. So these are the variation that we can get if we had moved the knight to c3 square. So let's say we didn't move the knight to c3 square, we moved the knight to f3 square. Okay, so this is also the Queen's Gambit decline variation. So let's try to continue the game further. So let's say here we move this knight, the knight to f6 square, and then now we move the this knight to c3 square. So this is known as the Queen's Gambit declined 3 knights variation. As you can see, the 3 knights are out there. So after this, to continue the game, we can move the bishop to e7 square. Okay, then the white bishop to g5 square. Now for the black, we can go for h6 square. So the bishop goes here to h4 square. Then for the black, we can go for the castling. And for the white, we can go for the e pawn to e3 square. So this position is known as the Queen's Gambit declined neo-orthodox variation. So this is known as the neo-orthodox variation. And to continue the game in this position, we can use the b pawn to move to b6 square. Okay, now as you can see, this developed position, now this position is known as the Queen's Gambit decline Tartakova defense. Okay, so to continue in this variation, now it will be the white turn. So we can use the white bishop to move to d3 square, and then the black bishop to b7 square. So now for the white, maybe we can go for castling here. So the winning right now would be equal for black and white. So what we can do is, for the black, we can move the knight to d7 square. So this is how an overview of how we can move under this Queen's Gambit decline one of the variation. So just now we moved the knight to f3. So we already looked the variation under c3. Now we already look at the variation under the f3. Now let's say we didn't move the knight, but we went for the pawn. Pawn capture the d5 pawn. So what are the variation we will have under this position? So let's see. So cx d5. Then the pawn goes for the white pawn. So ex d5. So this would be a normal Queen's Gambit declined variation. So now we can go for the knight to c3. And we can move the c pawn to c6 square. And then we can go for the bishop, develop the bishop to f6 square. So this would be a normal variation of Queen's Gambit declined. So let's go to the starting position. So just now we moved the e6 to get the Queen's Gambit declined variation. So again, let's refresh on the Queen's Gambit position, which is d4, d5 and c4. And now we will take a look at the what will happen, what will the variation we get if the d pawn captures the c pawn. So dx c4. Okay, now when the d pawn captures the c pawn, and this position, it is known as the Queen's Gambit accepted variation. Okay, just now we looked at the decline and now this is the accepted variation. So what are the other variation we can get under this position? Okay, let's just continue the game. So what we can do is we can move the knight to f3 square. So once you move the knight to f3 square, this is the Queen's Gambit accepted normal variation. This is the normal variation. And now in this position for the black, you can go for the knight to f6 square. Okay, then we can move the e pawn to e3 square. So for the black, we can go for e pawn to e6 square. And then the bishop capture the c pawn, bx c4. And now for the black, you can use this. You can move the c pawn to c5 square. Okay, so now this position, as you can see, this position is known as the Queen's Gambit accepted classical defense. So Queen's Gambit accepted classical defense. So how we can continue the game under here is perhaps we can go for castling for the white. So we go for the castling. And then we can, for the black, you can push the a pawn to a6 square. So a pawn to a6 square. And this is known as the classical defense, the main line. This one is the main line. So down, what we can do is we can move the white bishop to b3 square. White bishop to b3 square. And then for the black, we can go for the knight to c6 square. Okay, to continue the game, we can move the white knight to c3 square. So we had played until here. So until here, it is known as the classical defense mainline variation. So now let's go back to the original position. So just now we captured this, that's why we get the classical defense. So now let's say we didn't capture and we moved the knight to c6 square. So the black knight to c6 square. Okay, now this is known as the another declined variation, which is the Queen's Gambit declined. and it is known as the Chigorin defense. So how we can continue or develop the pieces under this variation is maybe we can go for the knight to the c3 square, knight to c3 square. Then we can go, the black pawn can go after the white pawn, so dx c4, and the white knight to f3 square. So this is known as the Chigorin defense, but known as also Januszky variation. As you can see here, Januszky variation. So what we can do to continue the game is, for the black, we can develop the knight to f6 square. So once you move this knight here, now it is known as the Chigorin defense of modern variation. Now this position is known as the Chigorin defense modern Gambit variation. Okay, so for the white now, we can push the e pawn to e4 square, and then we can go for the black bishop to g4 square. Okay, so this is how we can an example of how we can develop the pieces under the Chigorin defense of Queen's Gambit decline. So now, let's say next we will use our pawn, e pawn to e5 square. So what is this variation called as? It is known as the Queen's Gambit decline, Albin counter Gambit. So this position is known as the Albin counter Gambit. So what we can do in this is, so the d pawn goes after the e5 pawn, so dx e5, and then for the black, either you can go for, you can push the pawn in front, or you can go for the capturing. So let's say in this case we used to push the d pawn to d4 square, and then we can use the knight to move to f3 square. Okay, now we will move the knight, white knight to f3 square. So for the black, what we can do is we can go for the b knight to c6 square. So knight to c6 square. Now this is known as the normal variation of the Albin counter Gambit. So to continue the game in this position, for the white, you can go for the g pawn to g3 square. Okay, so as you can look at this position, this is known as the Albin counter Gambit fianchetto variation. So let me write down for you in the screen. So fianchetto variation. Okay, so under this, how we can continue the game is we can go for the knight, g knight to e7 square. And for the white, we can move our bishop to g2 square. And now we can develop the black knight to g6 square. So this is what we can see under the Albin counter gambit. This is roughly how you can develop the pieces under this Albin counter gambit. So if you move the e5 square, it will be the Albin counter gambit. So next, let's take a look what variation we will get if we move the bishop to f5 square. So bishop to f5 square. And now this is known as the Queen's Gambit declined Baltic defense. Baltic defense. So under this position, to continue the game, we can move the pawn to capture the d5 pawn. So c pawn capture the d5 pawn, cx d5. And then what we can do is for the black, we can use the bishop to capture the knight here. So bx d1. And now the queen, for the white, queen goes to a4 square. It's a check. So for the black now, we can push the c pawn to c6 square. So this is an example of how we can develop our pieces in the Baltic defense. So to continue the game, now what we can do is the rook captures the bishop now. So this is how we can develop the pieces under the Baltic defense. Okay, let's go back. So now next, let's take a look at what are the variation we can get if we move the c5 square. So now we'll move the c to c5 square. Okay, now this is known as the Queen's Gambit decline Austrian defense. So this is known as the Austrian defense. And what we can do here is c pawn captures the d5 pawn, so cx d5. And then what will happen is the queen goes for the d5 pawn, so qx d5. And then we will develop, for the white, we can develop the knight to f3 square. So this is one of the example how to develop the pieces under the Austrian defense. So let's take a look a little more what we can move. So now in this position, the black c pawn goes after the d4 pawn, so cx d4. And then for the white, you can develop the knight to c3 square. So now let's take a look at some other variations. We are done with the c5. Now let's say the knight goes to f6 square. The knight goes to f6 square. What are the variation we can get from here? So this one is known as the Queen's Gambit declined Martial defense. So this position, it is known as the Martial defense. So in this position, what we can do is the pawn can go after the d5 pawn, so cx d5. And then the knight goes after the d5 pawn, so nx d5. And then you can push the e pawn to e4 square. So it will be attacking the knight e4. So the knight would go here, so to f6 square. So knight to f6 square. And then for the white, you can start to develop the minor pieces. We can go for the knight to move to c3 square. And for the black, can push the e pawn to e5 square. And again for the white, we can go for the knight to f3 square. And then the e pawn can capture the d pawn, so ex d4. And queen goes after the pawn, so qx d4. So this is how you can develop your pieces under the Martial defense of the Queen's Gambit decline. And now what you can do is, let's just see two more positions. So you can go for this. So queen capture d4 and then knight captures the queen. So this is how you can develop the pieces under the Queen's Gambit declined martial defense. So now today we had seen what are the variation we had under the Queen's Gambit defense. We had looked at the semi-slap defense, Albin counter gambit, Chigorin defense, and so many. So before end the lesson for today, let's just take a look at the position of Queen's Gambit again. So it is d4, d5 and c4. So I hope you understand briefly on the overview of moves that we have under this Queen's Gambit. So make sure you plan on your move, as even a is bad plan at all. So take care till we meet on the next lesson. Thank you.